Hello, welcome to section 4, passwords and passwordless. In this section, we're going to cover both the user experience of handling user registration, login, and forgotten password flows, and also the technical side of securely storing and verifying passwords. Good user experience is very important when it comes to passwords, as the weakest link is often our users and their choice of password. By helping them with good user experience, we can help encourage them to choose good, secure, and hopefully unique passwords. We also have a responsibility to our users to store passwords securely, as there's a good chance they are actually reusing those same passwords on lots of other websites. So we don't want to be the weak link to the website that's compromised and results in that user's online accounts being stolen for other services as well as our own. We're going to start by looking at the user experience of a user registration form and a login form. We'll cover what information to collect, what validation to show to users, when to show those validation errors, and ultimately, our goal here is to maximize the number of users that successfully register and log into our application. But at the same time, we want to minimize the risk of malicious people impersonating other users. So this means we need to maximize the probability that users choose a secure, unique password. In many ways, it can seem like it's a trade-off between a secure system and an easy-to-use system. But at the same time, if your system is too hard to use, you'll encourage users to choose poor, weak passwords, and that will make your system less secure anyway. Let's start by looking at what we collect. We'll need something like an email or a phone number that will allow us to send password reset messages of some kind. And we really can't get away from that in most systems we build. We'll also need a password if we're going to do password-based authentication, and we might look at some alternatives to that later, but we probably don't need to ask them for any other profile information up front. It's better not to use a username because users find it easier to remember email addresses anyway, and because that email address serves the dual purpose of allowing you to contact the user. But if you want to, you might want to ask for a display name, and it might be worth doing that as part of the user registration form. But in general, it's really worth keeping the info at this stage to a minimum to maximize the chances that your users successfully sign up. When it comes to the form itself, we should try and focus the first field automatically. So that's usually the email address or the phone number field on our registration page so that users don't have to use the mouse to select it. We'll also need to validate the data entered by the user. If it's a phone number, we could also think about providing a selector for the country code to help people with that. And we could pre-populate it with their country based on their IP address. But when it comes to email addresses, it's just simple validation. And we're looking for common mistakes or for things that are obviously not email addresses. There's no need to try and get too precise with the specification here. In either case, we should show an error if the data isn't valid, but we shouldn't show that data until the user has touched the field. And touched as a term comes from the Redux form project and the Final form project, both of which are really good tools for building forms, especially if you're using React. The idea of touched is that a field on a form is said to be touched once the user has focused it and then unfocused it, or if they attempt to submit the form as a whole. So showing error messages before that time adds to the confusion on the page, gives the user much more stuff to read and think about. And for the most part, users don't need a validation message that disappears once they get their email address right, because people are used to filling in their email address. But if for some reason the user did need a validation message for their email address, it's a good idea to keep it updating in real time once the message has been shown. When it comes to picking something like a username, it's a good idea to show immediate feedback from the start on whether the name is valid and available, because even if there's clear rules for what constitutes valid username on your site, they've still got to pick one that hasn't been taken by someone else. If we impose password requirements, such as at least one letter, at least one number, at least one capital letter, we should show these immediate and ideally use some UI to indicate when they've been satisfied. There's nothing worse than coming up with a password, typing it in, finding it doesn't meet the requirements so that you need to add a special character on the end of it or add a number on the end of it. Doesn't necessarily lead to the most secure passwords either. And you're also going to really frustrate people using password managers if you have any password requirements that impose maximum lengths and you don't say so up front. Although incidentally, don't have a maximum length on your password. There's no justification for that. I mean, sure, limit people to under, say, 200 or under 500 characters, but there's no need for a 20 or 30 character limit. Storage is cheap. It's also important that we list those password requirements on the login page. So malicious attackers can find out what our password requirements are from looking at the registration page. So we're not helping to protect our system by hiding those details, but knowing what the requirements are will help users remember what password they chose when they logged in initially. Another alternative, though, is instead of arbitrary requirements, you could consider a strength meter. In this instance, you'd have no minimum strength for your password, but you have a clear kind of gamified indication of how secure a password they've chosen. And you can often trust users to choose how secure they want to be. Particularly for consumer-facing applications, that's a really good approach. We should avoid repeating fields as they make the registration form much more frustrating, and they're not even that effective at preventing errors and mistakes. Instead, consider making passwords visible to the user. There's very little evidence to suggest that an attacker looking over your shoulder is a common method of password stealing, and this is especially true on small mobile devices. Showing the user what they're typing as they type it is a much more effective way of preventing errors than making them repeat themselves. And my advice is to have a little button to show and hide the password. You can then default it to visible on the registration form, which they only need to fill in once anyway, and they're much more likely to be doing it at a safe, secure location where they trust the people around them, and then make it hidden by default on the login form, where they're going to have to fill it in every single time they want to sign into your website. In either case, though, they should be able to change to show the password if they're struggling or if they're not sure what they've typed, and they should be able to hide the password if they are worried about people looking over their shoulders. It's also important to show a login with existing account link on your registration page and vice versa on your login page in case people click the wrong button when they first got to your website. And it's good practice to use phrases that are distinctive. Sign in and sign up are too similar, so they can often take time for users to register. So go for something like login and sign up, login and register, sign in and register. Go for things that look visually distinctive so they're easier to spot. This isn't a course on how to build web apps in general, so I'm not going to show you very much detail on how I've implemented these suggestions, and I haven't necessarily implemented all of these suggestions perfectly, but I'll quickly run over some of what I've done to improve our login and registration experience on this simple app. So I already created a simple Webpack config with an entry point for my login and register pages. And now I'm going to add a pre-start script to build that Webpack bundle. And in a real production application, I'd have a version of this for development and a version of this for production with various optimizations. Then I just need to swap out the rendering of the login and register pages to serve my client-side code. It's virtually impossible to create a good forms experience without some JavaScript, so I've chosen to rebuild them in React. The client-side code uses React Final Form to build a more advanced register and login form. And I could make an entire video course on building good forms, so I'll leave it as an exercise to you to read through and see how I've put this form together. So I did have some validation on register to check the two password fields match, but I've no longer got two password fields. Instead, I'm going to check that the password matches the requirements that we now have. And in this case, I have chosen to go with a traditional requirement of at least one letter, at least one number, and so on, just to show you how that looks when it's done well. So now I can start the server and it will first run Webpack to bundle up my client-side code. I can register and log in with my newly designed form. I'll need to choose a password that's considered secure, and this tends to be a great example of why these kind of password requirements aren't always very effective. You can see how the ticks appeared as I typed, so I knew I was meeting the password requirements. Except it turns out I have an invalid password. So that was req.body.password, and it's because we should have done not is valid password and thrown the error on the case that the password was not valid. So I'll just try that again. Select my email address again, and I need to restart the server as well. Okay, fourth time lucky. Okay, and I've helpfully been signed in automatically. And I'm now using my email address as my username, so we would need to also take a display name of some sort if we wanted to clean that up, but for my purposes, just showing the email address is fine. So if I log out and log in again, this time the password is hidden by default, and I'm also not showing tick boxes once I've met the requirements for the password. However, I am still showing the list of requirements that I must have satisfied with my original password. And I can show the password if I'm unsure whether I've chosen the right one. And then once I'm sure, I can click login.